The Witcher 3 is often hailed as one of the best open-world RPGs ever created, and I think part of the reason it's garnered that amount of praise and recognition is because of its generally above-average quest design with regards to its narrative presentation. Typically in these types of games, it's easy for the quests to devolve into shallow, repetitive, banal tasks like your basic item fetching and monster killing affairs. And even though The Witcher 3 still falls victim to those formulaic genre tropes, it does a superior job relative to a lot of other games in giving these simplistic tasks interesting stories with interesting characters and occasionally interesting choices and consequences. Even though the gameplay involved in completing some of these quests can be incredibly simple and straightforward, as exemplified by the shallow reliance on Witcher senses, wherein you simply follow glowing trails and click on glowing hotspots the entire time, the quests usually prove engaging to follow because of the stories they're telling and the scenarios surrounding them. Even a basic task like fetching a frying pan out of a hut literally right next to the quest giver has interesting and engaging elements, what with the character's backstory of how she came to lose her pan, fun interactions when she comments on why Geralt's talking to himself.
What's that, dearie?
Nothing.
The detective element of deciphering the scene and figuring out what happened, and some foreshadowing for a plot point that will come into fruition later in the game. If you boil the quests down to their most basic and fundamental gameplay elements, they're really no better than most other games of this style, but the quests are all elevated by the wonderfully rich and detailed narrative framing that contextualizes what you're doing in this world and why you should care, in a far more engaging and interesting way than so many other similar types of games. I've already covered The Witcher 3 rather extensively in my comprehensive critique, so if you want to hear more detailed thoughts on the actual quest design overall, then I'd suggest watching the relevant sections of that review. For this video, I just wanted to focus on some of my personal favorites and why I enjoy these quests specifically. Some of these will probably be popular choices that a lot of other people agree are among the game's best, but I would also guess that a few of them are more unique to my own personal tastes that tend to go underrated by others, so you may find a few unusual and unexpected entries in this roundup. Note that for this video, I'll only be considering quests from the base game, Wild Hunt, not including any quests from Hearts of Stone or Blood and Wine. Although there are many quests in those expansions that would rank highly on my personal list, those ones I feel are less interesting to talk about because I would basically be putting the entirety of the main questline from Hearts of Stone at the top, and my picks from Blood and Wine would be all of the usual suspects that everyone already talks about anyway, with perhaps special attention given to the Warble of a Smitten Knight, Beyond Hill and Dale, and La Cage aux Folles. If you want to know more of my thoughts on the quests in those games, I'd recommend watching my respective critiques for the two expansions where I already go into a lot of detail on those specific quests, plus many more. Please note that this is not a ranking of the objectively best quests, it is merely my personal opinion based on the quests that I personally find the most fun or interesting. I'm also going to be spoiling the plotlines and outcomes of some of these entries, so bear that in mind and treat the entire video as spoilers. And so without further ado, here are my favorite quests from The Witcher 3 in some loose attempt at a ranked order. Honorable mention number 1, The Tower Outta Nowheres. This quest has a simple premise. A tower has mysteriously appeared next to a village in Skellige, bringing with it constant thunderstorms that prevent the villagers from fishing and providing for themselves. Your task is to find a way inside and solve the mystery of what's going on with the tower. The gameplay here is pretty simple and basically just involves searching inside the tower for key items and fighting a few enemies, but what makes it interesting is its metaphorical representation of real-world issues like digital rights management and CD Projekt's good old game service trying to combat DRM. For anyone who's unaware of the backstory, DRM is often considered an anti-consumer practice that publishers enforce on their games to prevent them from being digitally pirated. Oftentimes, DRM will have performance impacts on the game and the user's computer, or have restrictive activation limits that can make a game you've legally purchased unusable. CD Projekt's parent company runs a service called GOG, which at one point stood for Good Old Games, that proudly distributes games DRM-free. So the premise of The Tower Outta Nowheres is that the tower was built by a mage with a central automated defense system called the Defensive Regulatory Magicon, which caused it to activate things like golem sentries and flooding the library, all to prevent trespassers from getting in, while also rendering the tower completely unusable and trapping a visiting mage who's come to explore the tower inside a force field. The only way to lower the DRM's defenses is with Gottfried's omni-opening grimoire. Ultimately, all you really do in the quest is find a key, find a book, fight some golems, and so on, but the whole premise is comically entertaining, plus it has some other fun, supernatural elements like Geralt getting teleported out of the tower over the bay, and the heroic action of making the tower teleport away and thus driving away the storms that have been plaguing the island. It's not especially noteworthy otherwise, but the DRM and GOG stuff are fun little nods to appreciate. Honorable mention number 2. Through Time and Space.
I hate portals.
This is a main quest that happens later in the game, in which you accompany Avallac'h, the elven sage who acts as a sort of mentor for Ciri, through parallel worlds trying to reach the homeworld of the Wild Hunt. The background lore of The Witcher's universe is, of course, that there exist a bunch of parallel worlds or dimensions, and that an event long ago known as the Conjunction of the Spheres caused multiple worlds to intersect with one another, thus introducing things like magic and monsters and different races into each other's worlds. Part of what makes Ciri so special is her ability to freely jump between these alternate dimensions, and the Wild Hunt likewise comes from another world and is trying to invade the one in which our hero, Geralt of Rivia, inhabits. That's a deeply fascinating bit of science fiction that's been injected into this dark fantasy world, which I find unique and interesting. What makes this quest fun is the simple fact that it gives you the opportunity to travel to other worlds yourself, which helps to exemplify the lore and backstory of this world in a more direct, interactive, and engaging way. The landscapes you visit are, of course, weirdly alien and therefore incredibly exotic and unique for this dark fantasy world, and I also like that the penultimate world you land on is one that has already been overtaken by the White Frost, the apocalyptic event that has been prophesied and against which you've been fighting ever since the first game. The Witcher 3 has the Wild Hunt as the main villains who are supposedly bringing about the end of times in the form of the White Frost, but you don't really get to see them doing a whole lot throughout the game, so the threat is always kind of vague and abstract the entire time, until you arrive at this world and get to see the effects of what will happen should the Wild Hunt succeed in their mission. Plus, it has some unique gameplay elements with trying to navigate the bitter cold while seeking shelter, healing up at fires, and reading journal entries from this world's inhabitants describing events as their world slowly dies, which are fun things that you don't really see in other quests. Honorable mention number 3, the play's The Thing. This quest earns a mention for purely personal reasons, given that I have a bit of background in theater across several dimensions, mostly as a professional musician, but also as an actor and set technician in college. I don't care much for basically anything to do with Novigrad's main questline, because the whole thing gets bogged down too much with arbitrary sub-goals and deals too heavily with politics and the criminal underground for my taste, and so this little moment when you put on a play to lure Dudu out of hiding was a rare bright spot of interest for me. I liked making decisions about whether it'll be a drama or comedy, what to title it, who should play each role, memorizing my lines, and watching it all play out. Plus, it can be pretty comical depending on your decisions or if you pick wrong lines of dialogue. And now with the honorable mentions out of the way, we can move on to my actual top 5 with number 5, Master of the Arena. This quest is incredibly short and simple, and it simply involves walking into a new village, talking to a pair of NPCs, and then fighting someone in the arena. That's it. Normally that wouldn't be much to write home about, but you're not just supposed to defeat someone in the arena, you're trying to exorcise a spirit whose soul has been bound to the arena, cursed to lose for all eternity. This story point is hinted at before you even arrive at the arena itself, with you overhearing a conversation about a local villager celebrating his victory over Ulla the Unlucky, only to have someone else squash his bravado by pointing out that Ulla always loses and that he should come back and boast once he's defeated a real foe. The backstory to this quest is that Ulla used to fight in the arena long ago and would always lose, and then one day went up against a Jarl who mocked and ridiculed him so much that Ulla snapped and stabbed him in the back. The Jarl then cursed Ulla to lose for all eternity as he lay dying. So because Ulla continually haunts the arena, the locals can't hold normal tournaments, and thus Witcher Geralt is hired to get rid of the ghost. The reason I like this quest so much is because it's a rare instance of a quest design in The Witcher 3 where you have to make an insightful decision on your own to solve the quest yourself, instead of following blatantly obvious objective prompts or glowing hotspots. If you treat it like a straightforward quest and simply follow the objective marker to defeat Ulla, the quest will never resolve itself and you'll be stuck in an infinite loop of Ulla continually returning to the arena to lose again the next day. The solution, therefore, is to throw the fight and let Ulla win, which, although fairly obvious if you've paid attention to the backstory, isn't explicitly told to you through the quest mechanics, so it's a rare moment where player input actually matters. I also find Ulla's jaded and cynical banter before and after the fight to be pleasantly amusing, where he's so over the prospect of perpetually losing in the arena that he's belittling and ridiculing people for pounding their chest and trash-talking him.
Just spare me your jabber, your cries of die, wraith, and I shall defeat you, spectre of the arena. I've heard them all 1,000 times. Dreadful sick of them.
You know, sharp claws, animal skulls on their heads, attack in swarms.
Neckers?
Yeah, neckers! Near 20 of them. So will you help? Will you kill the bastards?
Number 4, Skellige's Most Wanted. In this quest, you're hired to kill a group of Neckers who attacked a caravan's wagon outside of town, but the quest giver is acting a little bit suspicious with the details and is seemingly unconcerned about how to resolve the business transaction once the task is complete. When you arrive at the scene, you realize that the guy's story doesn't really add up, and then it becomes apparent that you are set up to be killed in an ambush by what would seem to be a highly intelligent Necker pushing a boulder down the hill at you.
Something tells me that was no accident. Better investigate.
The rest of the quest is then a series of following trails and clues with several twists and developments along the way, where nothing is really as it seems.
What's going on here?
The quest comes to a head when you discover that everything you've encountered was deliberately set up and planned in advance, and are then confronted by a group of sentient monsters who are trying to kill and or scare you away from their turf because they know that witchers exist for the sole purpose of killing monsters. At which point you're given the option to defend yourself by arguing that you don't just kill all monsters indiscriminately, only ones that pose a direct threat to humanity and have no higher thought processing to control their violent urges. If in fact you've chosen to spare certain other monsters in previous quests, you can prove this to them and avoid a more difficult fight. I like this quest because it's a clear-cut example of how prior decisions can have long-lasting consequences that you couldn't possibly have anticipated when you were making them. Although the consequence is pretty small in this case and only applies to this specific quest, it does give the world a more tangible form of consequence, that the decisions you make and the things you do in this world actually matter. It's also a quest that deals heavily with the core concepts of being a witcher, a monster hunter for hire, which is a concept that's often overlooked and thrown to the side in these games where, especially in the second and third ones, you spend a lot more time dealing with politics and human intrigues and actually performing your more traditional duties as a witcher. And I also just like the way the story progressively unfolds, with little details progressively revealing themselves along the way to the final confrontation. Number 3. Cave of Dreams. This quest happens in Skellige, where you help one of the Jarl's sons and his crew explore the Cave of Dreams, where it's said you'll face your greatest fears. Mechanically, the quest follows a series of encounters where you descend deeper and deeper into the cave, seeing visions of each of Blue Boy Lugos' crewmates' fears and then battling to conquer them, but what makes it interesting is its utterly fantastical presentation. The encounters themselves are kind of simple and straightforward, but it's the storytelling combined with the ethereal, nightmare-like presentation of these visions that make it stand out as so unique and interesting. Each encounter has a little bit of character development for each of the crewmates, usually with these details having been set up at some point prior to the encounter itself. Most of them are fairly inconsequential, as Blue Boy's crew are insignificant characters, but Blue Boy himself is a fairly prominent figure, being one of the Jarl's sons who is vying for the crown of Skellige, and so getting to see into his nightmares helps to expand on the political situation of Skellige. What really matters here is Geralt's nightmare. He's established as being this badass warrior who's afraid of nothing, and everyone's anxious to see what would actually scare a witcher, and then it's revealed to be not just the king of the wild hunts, but them capturing Ciri. This is an incredibly grave thing to be afraid of, because the Wild Hunt is pretty much the riders of the apocalypse, and I would guess that most people would never be personally afraid of them by nature of having had no direct interaction with them, whereas Geralt rode with them in the past. As an external threat, there's probably no greater force to be afraid of than the Wild Hunt, and so it establishes that Geralt really doesn't have much to be afraid of other than the most serious and dire threat that the world will ever face. But it also gives insight into just how much he loves and values Ciri, that his greatest fear is something bad happening to her. I think this is also like the only moment in the game before the finale where we get to see a direct, personal interaction between Geralt and Eredin, even though it's only a vision, which helps to set the tone for the game's central threat. Number 2. A Tower Full of Mice. As a single self-contained quest, this is my absolute favorite in the game. Ever since the original game from 2007, I've been a big fan of the series' mythology, detailing how the evils of humanity can manifest themselves in the form of actual monsters, and how witchers have to walk the line to protect humans not just from ordinary monsters, but from themselves and their own creations. A Tower Full of Mice is, to my eyes, a classic Witcher story about a witcher trying to vanquish a monster which has strong ties to the human world. In this quest, you're sent by Kiara Metz to lift a curse that's been afflicting a small island once owned and inhabited by a family of nobles. During a time of famine, the local peasants decided to attack the nobles to steal some of their food, but a mage there had been secretly experimenting on rats infected with the Catriona plague. In the process, the rats were let loose and the princess was left to die, paralyzed by a potion, being eaten alive by rats. Thus, the isle became cursed with the princess turning into a plague maiden. Geralt's goal, therefore, is to find a way to defeat or release the spirit of the plague maiden and thus lift the curse on the princess and the rest of the island. This quest has some of the best atmosphere in the entire game, what with you exploring the island hunting for ghosts with a magic lantern and watching as the backstory of the island is progressively told through ghostly flashbacks and scattered notes. The green hue everywhere is obviously symbolic of the plague, but it also just bathes the environment in this really thick and unique ambiance. There's some generally weird and creepy stuff going on in the tower too, like pictures moving on their own and spectral corpses appearing out of the corner of your eye, so it gives the tower a genuinely haunted feeling appropriate for its ghost hunting premise. The final decision on how to lift the curse also carries significant weight to it, with there being no ostensibly good or bad choice. One is obviously worse than the other, but both have somewhat tragic outcomes, and picking the better of the two evils requires that the player make a smart choice and not fall for the Plague Maiden's ploy. Like with Master of the Arena, that decision is one that isn't explicitly telegraphed to you through Geralt's inner monologue or the quest objectives or Witcher senses, so it's entirely on the player to realize that something doesn't seem quite right with their story and to trust your own gut instinct. So for me, this quest is a perfect blend of strong atmosphere and engaging role-playing options, with some interesting storytelling going on too. Number 1. The Ladies of the Wood. This selection is not really for one specific quest, but is an umbrella for everything involving the crones of Crookback Bog, including the Whispering Hillock and Return to Crookback Bog, among others, which is all part of the main questline in Velen. That might be cheating or bending the rules a little, but I just love everything to do with the crones and therefore can't narrow down a single particular quest for them. To me, everything with the Ladies of the Wood is a perfect, iconic representation of the tone and atmosphere that the world of The Witcher is supposed to convey, or at least what I find most alluring, and that opinion is based solely on my experience playing the video games and how the first game established the tone of this world. What makes this universe interesting to me is the way that the evils of humanity manifest themselves in physical forms, the relationship between humanity and certain monstrous deities, the moral gray areas that these stories explore, and how it's all expressed through a sort of mythological folklore, and this questline does all of that in spades. The background for this quest is that the Ladies of the Wood are considered to be sisterly goddesses of sorts looking after the people of Velen after having conspired against and overthrown their evil mother ages past. There's this whole mythology about how to pray to the ladies for their blessing, involving a sort of Hansel and Gretel-esque process of giving up children to the ladies by sending them down a trail of treats, with annual festivals and entire villages dedicating to worshipping the ladies. I particularly love how the game explores the folklore of this, where it progressively devolves from the idealized stories you read in books about the ladies being kindly caretakers, to seeing glorified depictions of them in paintings, to realizing there's a barbaric element to some of their practices with people offering up children and sacrificing their own ears and body parts to the ladies, to finally seeing them in person as grotesque monsters who literally eat people for sustenance. When they task you with defeating the spirit under the tree in the Whispering Hillock, it's genuinely one of the most difficult decisions of the entire game series, because there's simply not enough concrete information to know what the best course of action is, as you're absolutely forced into trying your best to pick the lesser of two evils. The spirit is clearly supposed to give off this vibe of pure evil, but you kind of know that the ladies themselves are no saints, and you have to wonder if what you read about the mother in She Who Knows is actually true, or if that's a fabrication made up by the ladies' cult. Was the mother truly turning mad and the ladies did Velen a service by usurping her, or were the ladies the evil ones who killed their mother for their own greedy ambitions? Clearly, Velen is still a shitty hellhole by the time you get there, so they're obviously not doing a whole lot of beneficial good for the area, and the spirit promises to help rescue children in the process of being released, so it's a really tough decision to make. So as with the Tower Full of Mice, this quest just perfectly represents the kind of things I love about the Witcher setting, and I found its story revelations and role-playing decisions particularly fascinating. So those are some of my favorite quests in the game, but I'd also like to take a moment here to talk about some of the more generally popular ones that I didn't particularly like. After thinking about my most favorite and memorable quests, I went looking at online listicles and message boards and found a few that seemed to get mentioned with some regularity that would rank nowhere near the top for me personally. I'm not saying these are bad quests by any means or that anyone is wrong for liking them, but they each had some kind of issue holding them back from me, so I just wanted to share some thoughts on why I don't like them as much as some other people seem to. Dishonorable Mention number 1. Carnal Sins. This quest happens in Novigrad and plays out like a murder mystery where a main character, Priscilla, almost becomes the latest victim of a serial killer, thus causing Geralt to hunt down the killer and put them to justice. The story it tells is decently engaging, with you following several different leads, and it introduces some fascinating characters like the Doctor, Joachim von Gratz, and the Coroner Hubert Rake, but the problem is that the gameplay on this quest is just your typical shallow Witcher Sense festival where all you do is follow the glowing highlights and click on everything possible, letting Geralt make all the important observations and conclusions for you. And if you try to inject logical sense into its highly scripted scenarios, like in continuing to pursue the murderer after he's caught in the act without stopping to fight the innocent guards who have assumed you to be the killer, then the questline just completely breaks down and refuses to advance. The only time you have to make any sort of decision is near the very end when you're presented with an obvious red herring where the only sensible option is to inquire and interrogate the final suspect instead of going into a blind rage and attacking him on the spot. In this case, you're not solving a murder mystery, you're simply being told a story and you're stuck just following the script the entire time. The story is enjoyable enough, but the lack of player agency during this quest strips a lot of fun satisfaction out of it for me, and contrasts poorly against a similar quest in The Witcher 1 where you have to track down and cross-reference evidence, alibis, and motives on your own and pick a suspect yourself, as opposed to simply following the linear trail and then picking the obviously correct decision at the very end.
I needed to lift the curse that holds Udalric.
A curse?
Long story.
Dishonorable Mention number 2. Possession. In this quest, you're working with Cerys, a potential successor to the throne of Skellige, and lifting a curse on Jarl Udalric. The central premise is that Udalric had been possessed by a Heim, an evil spirit that feeds on guilt and remorse, of which Udalric was guilty of having not been able to save his brother during a storm at sea. Cerys and Geralt propose the possibility that they can trick the Heim to leave Udalric by moving to a new host, if they can get someone else in its vicinity to experience genuine guilt and remorse, which they'd have to accomplish by tricking a human bystander in the process. They stress that the guilt the new host would experience must be perceived as real to that person in order to be convincing for the Heim, but then Cerys and Geralt decide that they're going to trick each other instead of an unwitting third party, which would seem to defeat the entire purpose of the trick in the first place since they're both aware of a potential ruse. In the end, Cerys tells Geralt to throw Udalric's baby into a burning hot oven and to trust her about it, which you have the choice to do, and so I really don't believe that Geralt should be experiencing true guilt and remorse over killing a baby in that situation, because he should know in the back of his mind that this is part of Cerys' plan to trick the Heim, and therefore he should be skeptical of any actual harm befalling the baby. And if you've already inspected the backside of the oven to know it has a back door, then it makes even less sense of Geralt being fooled by this. Plus, it all happens so fast with Geralt chucking the baby in the oven and then having to defend himself against Udalric's guards that I feel like he wouldn't have time to really feel any emotion like guilt or remorse, since he'd be so caught up in the adrenaline of defending himself and trying to comprehend what's actually going on, when in the game the Heim just immediately starts latching onto Geralt before Cerys reveals that the baby was fine all along. It could have been an interesting quest, but the way in which the final trick plays out just feels illogical and nonsensical to me, almost like a plot hole. Dishonorable Mention number 3. Reason of State. This is another seemingly popular quest that I don't actually like for a couple of reasons, but right off the bat it feels out of character for Geralt and a Witcher in general to take on this quest based on how Witchers are established in the games. I always got the impression that Geralt hates politics and tries to claim neutrality as part of a Witcher's code to avoid getting involved in these types of situations when he doesn't want to be. And although he might agree that Radovid can't be left to rule, it still feels odd to me that you have to go along with this plan willingly. You're given the choice to opt out of the quest, but that creates an unsatisfying disconnect in me between picking the role-playing decision that I find most appropriate, which is to reject the quest and stay out of politics, especially something as major as this, and picking the choice that will lead to more interesting game content by agreeing to the assassination. That's actually a recurring problem I have with a lot of the game's smaller quests, where I often feel coerced into doing things I don't want to do just to see more content, which this quest really exemplifies. The rest of the quest plays out decently enough until its conclusion, when Dijkstra suddenly decides at the very end to try to murder all of his accomplices in a direct fight after brazenly declaring his intentions to them when he's already established earlier in the quest that he's really not a good fighter and not suited for that type of role in the initial plan. His motivation is somewhat understandable, but his method seems incredibly out of character and frankly stupid. He's supposed to be a clever, scheming spy who does all of his work from behind the scenes to avoid being directly involved in these types of head-on confrontations. So why is he not doing something more deceptive like letting them think everything is fine and then assassinating them sometime later on when they're unprepared and least expecting it? His sudden turn at the end didn't feel properly supported and thus came off like an illogical excuse to have the quest end in some kind of dramatic fight. So the whole quest was on shaky ground to begin with for me and then completely fell apart at the very end. So those are my thoughts on some of The Witcher 3's more notable quests that I liked or disliked for various reasons. Remember, this was not an objective ranking of quality or the ones I necessarily considered to be the best or worst quests in the game. They're just the ones that interested me most based on my own personal tastes and preferences. Still, there are a lot more quests in the game that might deserve special mention that I didn't cover in this video, so I'd be interested to hear what other quests resonated strongly for you, especially any of the smaller, less popular ones that don't get as much love from the community or gaming press. And remember, if you want to hear more of my thoughts on The Witcher 3, I'd recommend watching my comprehensive critiques for the base game, Hearts of Stone, and Blood and Wine, where I go into more detail on the quests and other topics in general. If you want to hear more specifically about my favorite quests from either of the DLC expansions, then let me know in the comments and I'll consider making a specific video for the DLC quests. Otherwise, I'd love to hear which of the three you feel had the best quests overall.